Hey, welcome to the briefing. What I'm going to cover with you today is this. When financial oversight stops protecting the district, act on the governance failure. The district had produced its first balanced general fund budget in years. That matters. A balanced budget is not a ceremonial document. Leaders hold up at a meeting so everyone can clap and pretend the hard part is over. It affects staffing, vendor confidence, classroom resources, benefits, facilities, program continuity, and whether the public believes the district can meet its obligations. So when the South Carolina Department of Education presented Marlboro County School District with a balanced budget in May of 2026, state leaders had evidence that the financial intervention was producing meaningful progress. The district was no longer relying on continued depletion of its fund balance to make the numbers work. Operational restructuring, staffing alignment, facility consolidation, and stronger financial planning had created a budget that projected an operating surplus. That is real progress. But a balanced budget can prove the recovery direction is working without proving the organization can sustain it. Those are different conclusions. Shortly after that progress became visible, the state had to confront a harder question. Had the district rebuilt the governing capability required to carry the recovery forward, or had the financial condition improved only because extraordinary outside controls were still carrying decisions the district's own governance structure had not shown it could sustain? Critical intervention should never begin with taking control. It should begin with evidence. What objective is being damaged? What measures have already been used? What did those measures correct? What remained unresolved? Where does the problem continue to originate? What will another failed cycle cost? What could direct intervention damage if it is applied too broadly? The more authority a leader intends to use, the more discipline that leader's read has to become. Critical intervention is not permission to move aggressively because the situation is serious. It is not a shortcut around patience. It is not somebody walking into the room, taking every lever, and calling that leadership because everyone else had to stop talking. Critical intervention fits when the problem is active, the objective is still being damaged, postponement is no longer responsible, stabilization is not enough, and the leader can act directly at a known failure point without creating unacceptable collateral impact. That standard is difficult on purpose. Local authority matters, community representation matters, institutional knowledge matters. The people carrying the daily mission matter, teachers, principals, finance employees, support staff, students, and families should not become collateral damage because leadership wants to prove it is doing something. At the same time, local authority cannot become a shield around a governance structure that is actively preventing the institution from recovering. Patience cannot become a professional way of avoiding the decision. That is the tension inside the Marlboro County situation. The district had been receiving support, oversight, and additional control for years. It entered fiscal watch in 2022. Recovery plans and technical assistance followed. A fiscal emergency was declared in February of 2025. In July, the state assumed control of financial operations and added experienced leadership support. The district was not left to solve a serious financial condition without authority, expertise, or guidance. That matters because justice requires us to inspect the support before condemning the result. You cannot withhold the means to perform, then blame the organization for failing to produce a recovery. The response had already moved through several levels of stabilization. The first responsible move in a public sector failure is usually not to remove authority. It is to protect the objective with the least disruptive action capable of working. Fiscal monitoring, recovery planning, stronger financial leadership, and transaction review can protect payroll, classroom instruction, vendors, and basic operations. They also reveal whether the organization can use support, follow the recovery plan, and rebuild capability under its existing governance. Stabilization is evidence. A leader should not move to direct intervention merely because recovery is difficult. Slow progress does not prove the governing structure must be removed. Loud criticism does not prove it. A contentious meeting does not establish the action point. That would be a broad reaction to pressure, not disciplined intervention. But the other failure is just as dangerous. Another review gets ordered. Another recovery plan gets written. Another approval gate gets added. Another consultant arrives. Another report identifies the same failure pattern with slightly more official language and a different cover sheet. Apparently, the problem was waiting for better formatting. The organization becomes extremely capable at documenting the failure while remaining unable to correct the source that keeps recreating it. That is where public sector leaders get trapped. They mistake the presence of controls for the restoration of control. A state can approve every major financial transaction and still have a district whose governing structure cannot sustain recovery. Supported performance and independent capability are not the same thing. I have learned to respect that distinction because supported performance can look convincing. The reports improve. The deadlines get met. People begin saying the problem is under control. Maybe it is, or maybe an experienced person is correcting every important decision and holding together a control structure that cannot yet stand on its own. The output improves, the capability may not. And that is hard to admit because the improved output feels like proof. The leader has to determine whether the control built capability or substituted for it. That is the distinction leaders have to hold. Progress deserves credit, but progress does not remove the obligation to inspect whether the organization can sustain the standard after support changes. The South Carolina Office of the State Inspector General completed an investigation covering district financial management and procurement practices across fiscal years 2020 through 2025. The report identified deficiencies across financial management, procurement, contracts, grant funds, tax and benefit liabilities, inventory control, board oversight, and governance. It reported financial exceptions totaling more than $7.35 million and material weaknesses in the district's ability to govern and provide fiscal oversight. Those findings changed the operating picture. The issue was no longer only whether the next budget could be balanced. The issue was whether the authority structure could reliably sustain financial control, procurement discipline, leadership continuity, implementation, and public accountability after extraordinary state support was reduced. One finding captures the distinction clearly. The district had purchased an inventory management system, but it had not purchased the training required for employees to use it. The software remained unused even though it could have supported required asset controls. Owning a control is not the same as operating a control. Buying a system does not create capability. Writing a policy does not create execution. Approving a plan does not implement the plan. Putting the correct software in the building and skipping the training is not a control system. It is an expensive icon sitting on a desktop while the inventory continues living its own private life. But bring that right back to the operational point. The organization can possess every visible part of the solution and still lack the leadership, training, follow-through, and governing discipline required to make the solution real. The state had to decide what problem it was actually managing. Was the active problem still financial instability? If it was, continued financial control might have been enough. The state could keep reviewing contracts, rejecting unsupported expenditures, directing budget planning, and producing stronger financial outputs. But if the deeper problem was a governance structure unable to sustain the recovery, another control on another transaction would not correct the source of the interference. A financial takeover can supervise the next decision. It cannot automatically create stable governance, reliable board oversight, leadership continuity, procurement discipline, or sustained implementation. It cannot create public trust merely by correcting the spreadsheet. That is where the distinction between tactical resolution and critical intervention becomes necessary. Tactical resolution stabilizes an active problem so the objective can continue moving. It controls the effect, buys time, and protects the operation while a larger correction is built. The state's financial intervention did that. It added control around budgets, spending, contracts, staffing decisions, and vendor obligations. It reduced immediate financial interference and helped produce a balanced budget. That was not a failed action. The stabilization did not become wrong simply because the state later moved to critical intervention. It was meaningful and necessary for the condition that existed at that time. But tactical resolution becomes inadequate when the stabilized condition still depends on the unresolved problem that created the failure. If the state must continue carrying every critical financial decision because the district's governance structure cannot sustain the standard, the temporary control has not completed the recovery. It may be keeping the condition from becoming worse. It may also be proving the deeper failure remains active. The stronger question is not whether stabilization is useful. The stronger question is whether it can protect the full objective. In Marlboro County, the objective was not merely one balanced budget. It was a stable school district capable of serving students, managing public funds, sustaining leadership, complying with controls, supporting educators, implementing recovery decisions, and retaining public confidence. A balanced budget supported that objective. It did not replace it. The state had three directions: return authority because the budget improved, continue financial control indefinitely, or act directly at the governance point while protecting the functioning parts of the district. The first could mistake one improved output for restored capability. The second could create a permanent shadow structure where the district looked locally governed while every serious decision waited for outside approval. That is administrative life support with a board meeting attached. The third was the critical intervention decision. On June 2, 2026, the South Carolina State Board of Education unanimously approved a State of Education Emergency Declaration and directed the South Carolina Department of Education to assume full management authority over the district. The action point was no longer the next expenditure, contract, or budget revision. The action point was district management and governance authority. That is what made the intervention direct. But direct action is not responsible merely because the target is visible. The intervention still had to be contained. The state did not close the schools. It did not remove every teacher. It did not treat principals, classroom staff, support employees, families, students, or every local employee as the source of the governance failure. It changed who held management authority while preserving classroom instruction, educators, student services, school operations, and the useful financial progress already achieved. A leader can identify a serious failure and still respond so broadly that the intervention damages the objective. In a district, that could mean replacing useful employees, centralizing routine decisions, weakening local knowledge, or turning recovery into a compliance exercise instead of a student-centered correction. That is why critical intervention is not the biggest action available. It is the most direct, contained action capable of stopping the active interference. The problem was governance. The intervention had to target governance. The objective was a stable district, not permanent outside control. An intervention can become its own failure point if it has no reassessment path. A transfer of authority may be necessary. It is not automatically the final condition. The Department of Education now has to protect classroom instruction, maintain the budget, strengthen procurement, clarify authority, build leadership continuity, and preserve useful local knowledge. It also has to communicate honestly with employees, families, vendors, and the community about what changed and what remains stable. The intervention has to build conditions for sustainable future governance. Otherwise, state management may improve outputs while repeating the same deeper pattern. The district performs because outside authority is carrying the work. The district remains dependent because local capability is not being rebuilt. The intervention becomes permanent because nobody established what readiness for restored authority would look like. That would not be successful critical intervention. It would be continued substitution. And does that make sense? The point is not to transfer control and congratulate everyone because the paperwork now moves through a different office. The point is to remove the active interference, protect the institution, rebuild capability, and create a condition the district can eventually sustain. This is where the consequence chain moves in both directions. If the state returned authority before the governing capability was ready, procurement failures could return. Leadership instability could disrupt recovery, and staff or vendors could lose confidence. The district could enter another fiscal emergency and another intervention. Students, teachers, families, employees, vendors, and taxpayers would carry the consequence. The recovery would appear to work until outside controls were reduced, but acting too broadly carries its own consequences. A takeover handled poorly can weaken local trust, reduce cooperation, and deprive state leaders of useful local knowledge. Centralized authority can turn routine decisions into approval bottlenecks. Talented staff may leave if the intervention treats the entire workforce as responsible. The district can become better at state reporting while becoming less capable of independent daily operation. The intervention can protect the budget and still fail to rebuild the organization. That is why collateral impact is part of the decision. Students and teachers are not administrative variables. Families are not public relations obstacles. Employees who carried the mission through unstable leadership should not be treated as the source of the problem simply because the failure occurred around them. Do not punish the people carrying the mission for the failure of the authority above them. Responsibility has to stay connected to authority, information, control, support, and opportunity. If the governing structure is the action point, act on the governing structure. Do not create organizational theater by correcting every employee except the people and authority points that allowed the failure to continue. And that kind of theater irritates me. Leadership will sometimes correct the people closest to the visible problem because they are easy to call into a meeting and easy to write into a corrective plan. Meanwhile, the people with actual authority remain above the consequences, explaining that the organization needs better accountability. Here's what that decision looks like once you stop pretending it is reasonable. Teachers and support staff are holding the district upright with both hands, while 3 offices argue over which form authorizes somebody to bring them a chair. The visual is ridiculous. The operating failure is not. The people carrying the mission are absorbing a governance failure they did not create. No, accountability has to move toward authority, not away from it. If the failure sits in governance, the correction has to reach governance. The visible issue in Marlboro County was financial instability. The deeper failure point was the gap between improved financial outputs and sustainable governing capability. The state had financial controls. The district did not yet have sufficient evidence of sustainable governance. That is the better read. The balanced budget was real progress, but it could not prove leadership would remain stable, procurement rules would hold after outside review was reduced, or the turnaround plan would be implemented without outside control. The better read is not, the budget balances, so the problem is fixed. The better read is, the balanced budget proves financial stabilization can work. It does not prove the district can sustain the recovery under the existing governance structure. The better read is also not, the board made mistakes, so the state should immediately take over. Direct intervention requires a demonstrated pattern, unsuccessful lesser measures, a clear action point, lawful authority, controlled scope, and a reassessment path. Oversight can supervise decisions. It cannot replace governance capability when governance itself is the source of the interference. That is where critical intervention fits. Critical intervention is a decisive action strategy for an active problem that cannot be postponed, cannot be stabilized enough to protect the objective, and must be acted on directly where it sits. The tool does not tell leaders to choose the harshest response. It tells them to stop treating a direct action condition like an endless stabilization problem. The problem has to be active. Delay has to increase damage. Previous containment has to be insufficient. The action point has to be clear enough to act on. The intervention has to be limited. The leader has to reassess the result. Critical intervention has 2 common failure patterns. The first is using it too early. The leader sees a serious issue and decides seriousness alone justifies direct action. The leader skips the evidence, skips stabilization, skips the collateral read, and skips the question of whether a narrower move could protect the objective. That is not decisive leadership, it is uncontrolled authority. The second failure is using it too late. The leader keeps adding temporary controls after the problem has outgrown them. The organization becomes dependent on oversight. The same failure keeps returning. Everyone knows where the source is, but nobody wants to own the decision. That is not patience. It is delayed accountability. Critical intervention exists between those failures. Do not rush the direct action. Do not keep stabilizing a problem after the evidence shows the source must be acted on. That boundary matters beyond one school district. A grant-funded program misses deliverables. Deadlines improve only while an outside specialist manages every important handoff. Is the program recovering or being carried? A public works queue moves only because one coordinator resolves every conflict between crews, dispatch, procurement, and inspection. Did the operation build capability or dependency? A contractor improves only while agency staff effectively manage its daily operation. Is the oversight protecting the service or concealing that the contractor cannot perform independently? The report improves, the deadline is met, the public dashboard turns green, but every success still depends on an extraordinary control that was supposed to be temporary. The dashboard is doing reputation management. That is the warning sign. Improved results do not always mean restored capability. Sometimes they mean the containment measure is carrying more of the operation than leadership has admitted. So bring the question into your environment. What objective is the oversight protecting? What has it corrected? What still fails? Which decisions require outside control? What happens when that control steps away? Has the organization learned to perform or to wait for someone else to decide? Is the failure inside one process, one role, one authority point, or the governing structure? What capability would direct intervention damage, and what evidence would justify acting now? Those questions do not complete the critical intervention process. They help a leader recognize whether the situation has crossed the line. Watch for the same findings returning under different wording, performance that improves only while outside authority is present, and one improved output being treated as proof the whole system recovered. Watch for recovery plans that exist but are not implemented. The issue may be whether the authority structure can execute them. And watch for an intervention nobody can explain how to end. When will it narrow? What capability must exist before ordinary authority resumes? What evidence will show the organization can sustain the standard? If nobody can answer those questions, the action may become permanent through inertia rather than necessity. That is not control. That is drift wearing an official title. Now connect this to the larger direct action system. CSA separates the financial condition from the governance condition and budget progress from sustainable recovery. That read feeds deepen. At first, tactical resolution through financial control and technical assistance fit the condition. Later, the evidence showed stabilization could not protect the full objective. That is where critical intervention entered. PRO keeps collateral impact visible. TMC protects authority, ownership, communication, and follow-through. ALC captures what failed, what improved, and what must exist before extraordinary intervention is reduced. The system supports the tool. The primary tool remains critical intervention. Let me make the final point precise. Critical intervention should be difficult to justify. Before acting directly, the leader should be able to explain what objective is being damaged, what stabilization has already been attempted, what it corrected, what remained unresolved, where the continuing failure is located, what delay will cost, what the intervention could damage, and what condition will trigger reassessment. The leader should also be able to identify the people and capabilities that are not the problem. Direct action without collateral awareness is simply another problem entering the system. In Marlboro County, financial oversight produced meaningful progress. It also produced evidence that financial control alone could not sustain the recovery. The state did not need another approval layer around the next transaction. It needed to act on the governance failure that kept the district exposed. That does not mean every troubled district needs the same answer. It means leaders must know when an active problem has moved beyond supervision and now requires contained action at the source. Do not act directly because the problem is loud. Do not act directly because the public is angry. Do not act directly because leadership wants to look decisive. Do not keep waiting because the decision is uncomfortable. Do not keep adding controls when the evidence shows the controls cannot protect the full objective. Act only when the problem cannot wait, stabilization is no longer enough, the action point is clear, and the intervention can be contained. Act on the failure point. Protect the people and capabilities still carrying the mission. Limit the intervention. Reassess the result. When you are ready to go deeper with this tool, go to www.direct-action-system.io/course-directory. Open the course directory, find the course tied to critical intervention, and deepen and start there. That is where the deeper application belongs. Thanks for listening to the briefing.